Good afternoon, everyone. We'll call to order the, almost forgot the day, the Thursday, July 1st meeting of the CPP's Transition Committee, the CPP's Policy Committee. It is 5:09. I'll kick it over to Charmaine to do a quick roll call.
Sure. Chair Halpert.
I'm here.
Commissioner Vaughn is trying to join the meeting. Commissioner Spruce.
Here.
Commissioner Andrea Dalba Griffin.
I'm here.
Commissioner Craver is absent. Commissioner Harrington is absent. Commissioner Case.
Here.
Commissioner Anderson is excused. That completes the roll call.
And I see Nancy is,
Oh,
she's in as an attendee. I'm moving her over. Okay. So for non-agenda public comment, I'm sorry, I skipped for the approval of the minutes from the February 25th, 2021 Policy Committee meeting. Are there any edits or revisions to the minutes? If not, can I have a motion to approve?
I move.
Okay, we have a motion from Robin. Can I get a second?
I second.
Andrea, and let's do a quick vote on approval of the minutes.
Commissioner Case.
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn.
She's muted.
Yes.
Thank you.
God
Nancy, I made you a co-host for you to be able to turn your video on.
damn. There.
Here you go. Thank you.
But
Hold on one second. Okay. Who was I up to? Commissioner Spruce,
Yes.
Commissioner Dalba Griffin,
Yes.
and the chair abstains. Motion passes.
All right, we don't have any non-agenda public comment. For unfinished business, we're going to leave that on. One of the things we had talked about and shared with the community is we want to propose doing a third-party mediation. We're not going to do that until we officially have full budget, which officially, as of today, we do with the new fiscal year. But we can't do anything until we actually have the implementation ordinance in place, which will give us the authority and the ability to do that. So we're leaving that on the agendas just as kind of a working item, so we keep it going, but no action on there. For new business, the first one we have is discussing body-worn camera changes. High level, and I can open it up for the committee members to discuss. The idea is we wanted to make a recommendation to have the police department kind of increase the officers and staff that would be using body cameras. So one of the ideas was having the watch commander's office staff have body cameras. So the idea there is if there's a detainee in the Sally Port, which is where if you're being arrested, you go in and you're being processed. If something were to happen down there, we feel it's helpful to have body cameras to be able to record that. There is surveillance footage that does catch that, but obviously that does not catch any audio. And then one of the other conversations we were going to talk about was having plainclothes officers that are doing searches, things like that, that they should have body cameras and have those activated during things like searches. So with that, I will open it up to a couple discussions. I think that was, I think a couple of people brought that one up. I believe Doug, Nancy, and Robin all had cases where BWC issues came up. So I'll open up the floor up to have you guys kind of talk about what you think, what you want, and then we can try to create an emotion.
Yeah, I can speak first. Specifically, I wrote a recommendation to the committee regarding plainclothes officers when they were not operating in a plainclothes capacity. So we understand as a commission that there is a need at times for plainclothes detectives to not be identifiable for sure. And then also times when those folks are working with people in a capacity where it wouldn't be appropriate, even if everyone's aware that they're police officers, to record. However, there have been times, we had a case fairly recently in which plainclothes officers were wearing vests and using that actually as a method to explain that they were presenting themselves as police officers, but then we're not wearing, that did not have body worn camera working or on. And there seemed to be confusion amongst those folks legitimately about like, we're plainclothes officers, so we don't use body worn camera. But we just feel that certainly going forward, it would be really helpful if it's clear that they're operating in a way that they are easily identified as police officers and interacting with the public, then it would be appropriate for them to wear a body worn camera and use it in those times.
Nancy, do you want to add anything to that?
No, I think she did good, as usual.
And if I could
Do you
chime in,
wanna
I agree that, you know, there are times when they're doing undercover work, for example, when plainclothes officers, you know, should not be wearing a body worn camera. But when they're doing searches, and I had a case where the subject officer was a plainclothes officer, so he wasn't wearing a body worn camera. And there was a complaint about his conduct of the search. I won't go into the details. And it would have been helpful to have been able to look at his body worn camera, but because he was plainclothes, he was not issued a body worn camera. And so I think any officer doing a search should be wearing a body worn camera.
And I think one of the other things, weird echo. One of the things I think we'd also kind of talked about is if anyone is filing a complaint directly to an officer, that it's probably helpful if their body worn camera is recording that complaint. So there's documentation of what specifically they were alleging to have happened. Sometimes it can be a little bit difficult if you have, say, for example, a field lieutenant that comes out to take a complaint. Rare, that doesn't happen a lot, but if that does happen, field lieutenants don't have body worn cameras, and so therefore they would not be able to do that. So I think that was one of the other ideas we could possibly discuss. The other one, I think I kind of briefly talked about it, I can just kind of bring it up, was expanding it to include all officers that are working in the watch commander's office. And again, the reason there is, you know, if there is a detainee that becomes unruly or has a medical issue or whatever, and the watch commander's staff comes out, we would like them to be able to activate their body cameras in addition to the officers who already have their cameras on. We just felt that that made sense since they are uniformed. They're obviously working, that it seems like that would be an appropriate extension of the body camera policy. Does anyone want to comment or elaborate on that?
I have a question, Brandon. Why don't the field lieutenants have body worn cameras? Would seem to me that they're involved in questions and situations where it would make perfect sense for them to be using it.
I probably don't have a great answer. To be honest, I don't know, but I would suspect it's probably because they're more of a supervisory, tactical type position. And so they're probably not equipped with body cameras, just because chances are when they're having conversations with other officers, it's about the tactics of whatever they may be doing. But I could be incorrect on that. In fact, I mean, we could ask, since we have the captain from Internal Affairs here, we could ask if he wants to clarify that, if I spoke out of turn or if I got something incorrect on that one. Not to put you on the spot, sorry.
You did, Brandon, but that's okay. I think most of it is that, yeah, they're the field lieutenant. They're not typically doing enforcement contact. They're normally there to, like you said, provide supervisory support throughout the city. And I know you were talking about recording complaints, and I'm pretty sure you guys are aware that a lot of people don't want to be recorded when they're giving complaints for various reasons.
Yeah, and just for background, one of the things that we had proposed a while ago was if someone is doing a complaint, we would prefer that that recording happen. And then if someone says, I don't want to be recorded, at least that way the recording catches the complainant saying, I don't want this to be recorded. And that way there's a legitimate use for the officer to then turn that off, and it's documented that the individual did not want that to be recorded. But I think just speaking on behalf of the commission, I think having those recorded or something that's documented is helpful, because that way we can make clear that whatever someone alleged in their complaint, that those are being investigated and properly documented and researched, and that's in the internal affairs report, and it's in what the CPP does. So thanks for providing feedback on that one. And Nancy, does that kind of answer your question there?
Yeah, but I'm wondering if in most situations, when they're called, there are other officers around who have body worn cameras. And I've seen, what did I see? I saw a search warrant where they had plainclothes officers doing the search, but they had uniformed officers there capturing most of the interaction with the people in the house. And I would think a similar thing could happen when a field lieutenant had to be called to take a complaint. One of the uniformed officers at the site could be asked to stand by and record the complaint. Anything like that would be very helpful, I think, to everybody who works with these complaints. That's all. Thank you.
Okay. Any other feedback, comments from anyone? If not, I think we have we can have a motion to, and again, just for any of the members of the public that are watching, typically what the policy committee does is we make a recommendation that goes to the full commission. The full commission would then vote on that, whether or not we agree to send that over as a recommendation to the police department. So I think the motion here would be to make a recommendation to the police department that plainclothes officers operating essentially in a non, clandestine capacity would need to have body cameras and activate them. And I think we would also include that to have, sorry, I'm trying to read my scribbly notes. We'd also have that include the watch commander's office staff.
Yes.
And then we can have a note about field lieutenants not requiring them to have a body camera, but that if there's something that becomes an issue, like someone's filing a complaint or something, that a uniformed officer who has a body camera should be there to help document that.
So moved.
So everyone, I was gonna say, does everyone agree mostly with that? Nancy does. Can I get a second?
I'll second.
I was gonna say, don't everyone jump at once. Okay, so we have Nancy and Andrea. Charmaine, do you want to do a vote?
Sure. Okay, Commissioner Case,
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn,
Yes.
Commissioner Spruce,
Yes.
Commissioner Dabble Griffin,
Yes.
and the chair abstains, motion passes.
Excellent. Second item we have is use of force opinion. So a little bit of background. So when internal affairs is investigating a case, a complaint, whatever, that involves use of force, sometimes it will ask the in-service training officer to give an opinion based on the use of force to determine whether or not it was appropriate given the policy and procedure. We realized that there's probably not enough guidance or direction on that specific issue. And so I drafted a memo that I will share my screen. From our understanding, part of the issue is no one within command reviews those opinions. And we had a case that I felt, and Nancy was on this as well. So Nancy, you can definitely chime in and speak to that, is I felt the use of force opinion essentially changed the intent of the policy. And I don't believe that was really what the police department wants. So this is going to be a little bit weird because obviously what sparked this was a specific case. We can't talk about specific cases in open session. But the memo itself really kind of addresses what I felt, and that's why I'm kind of opening up to everyone on policy to make some recommendations to the police department on how those should be reviewed and who reviews them. So on the second paragraph, the use of force opinion, the use of force expert independently changed the procedure, and again, that's 1.07, to include, quote, pre-assaultive cues. Nowhere in the policy is pre-assaultive cues included nor defined. And so our concern was essentially the use of force expert was saying it was justified to use the taser in a situation where the policy says it was not. So what I did is I copied the section of use of taser. I did highlight, so the bold and underlined is emphasis added by me. So the taser may not be used on subjects exhibiting assaultive behavior or life-threatening behavior. Goes on to a couple other things as well. The taser can be used to control someone actively resisting. Subjects reasonably believed to possess or have immediate access to a deadly weapon. That is an important clarifying remark. And again, I don't want to go into case-specific details on this, but I think that's where the use of force opinion got a little bit muddy. So what I did, because obviously this goes out to some people who may not be familiar with some of the terms or policy, I did put the actual definitions of those three items for assaultive behavior, life-threatening behavior, and active resistance. So the other issue we had here, and again, as I said, is we felt that the use of force opinion changed the intent of the procedure, which I don't believe is what we want to have happening. So our recommendations is I think that someone from the training command staff, I'm recommending a lieutenant or a captain, that they need to review, approve, and sign all use of force opinions. Right now, it's our understanding that use of force expert writes their opinion, they send it off, no one reviews it. And I feel that's important that someone has to have kind of an approval check just to make sure that what they're saying is accurate and appropriate, and more than just one officer who's writing that feels that way. The second one is I feel the police department city attorney needs to review use of force opinions to ensure that the opinion is legally valid and is within existing procedure and appropriate given the circumstances of that specific case. And then the third one was use of force opinions shall include only the facts available and not include potential scenarios that do not or did not exist, or nor narratives of what could potentially happen. And again, I think this is an area where it gets a little bit messy, and I don't want to go into, again, case-specific details here. But I think it's important that when the use of force expert is making an opinion, they can't be extrapolating of things that could potentially possibly happen, but that weren't happening. And I think in this one specific case, that opinion, I think, includes things that weren't really there. So that was my memo. I'll open it up to the table to comment, discuss, refute anything, make recommendations to change anything that I put in here. I'll open the floor up to anybody.
I have a clarifying question, Brandon.
Sure, go.
Where does so after the opinion is written, you say nobody appears to look at it or review it or approve it. So where does it go after it's written? Does it just go into the case file and that's where it remains?
Yeah, so it goes to internal affairs. Usually internal affairs will request that use of force opinion, but no one within the training staff appears to review it. So if you have the officer within training that writes that opinion, his sergeant, captain, lieutenant doesn't review that opinion before it is sent to internal affairs and included in that case file. So my thought, and not to say that this is what happens here, is say, for example, someone alleges an excessive use of force and internal affairs were to sustain it, to say that it did happen and it was an excessive use of force. If the use of force opinion basically kind of like in this case, basically says, the officer didn't follow policy, but it was okay to do that. My concern is that essentially opens that up to an appeal that I don't think should be appealable. I mean, an officer should be able to appeal a sustained finding, of course, but then they would be able to say, well, hey, internal affairs said this was sustained, but the use of force expert said that what I did was justified. So then you have this conflict. And that's part of why I think that we need to have more review here, because that could create a legal issue if you have, IA saying one thing and training saying another, and they don't mesh. So I think that's why it's important that there's a review process that currently does not exist.
In our case, they took the use of force opinion and used it to exonerate action that clearly, at least to our way of reading 1.07, should never have been exonerated. So they do use it, Andrea, so it's not like it just sits in the file. It gets used, but that's what's problematic.
And is this an external expert or an internal?
It's part of
internal.
their, in this case, it's a very highly respected trainer, let's put it that way, somebody I've known for 12 years. So,
Yeah, and I think that was just another question we had, and it may not be, I don't know precedent or what other police departments do when you are doing a review of force, but I think that some folks may have concern that the review of force is not done by an objective party, but rather someone from within the department who likely is the one who did the training. I think that is something to consider and discuss.
Yes, I agree with Robin, and it would be interesting to know, because it would be interesting to know how other departments do it in other jurisdictions. And of course, I suppose it's probably also a cost question, right? So the moment you bring in external reviewers or experts, it costs money, and so that may not be something that's feasible. But what is a little bit of a red flag to me is as Brandon pointed out, the circumstance that there is no feedback loop back to the person who wrote the opinion. So I think that is totally doable to recommend something that would mitigate, or at least start that sort of feedback loop between IA and the person who wrote the opinion.
Doug, do you want to chime in? You can say no.
No, I mean, I agree with the memo.
mhm.
So I think what probably makes the most sense is to probably make an additional recommendation that I did not have here, is that the person who's providing the training should not be the person who is providing the use of force opinion. And
Agreed.
I think, Robin, it was your point. I think you raised it. What do other departments do? I think I'd like to keep that out of this memo. I think we can do some research on the side, and then we can present what we find to the police department. But I'd rather keep this memo a little more clean. And I think if we're adding what other departments do, I think it gets a little confusing. So
I agree.
so
I'm
I
sorry,
put that as a.
what was your last point? I'm not sure I totally agree with that. You're saying that the training staff shouldn't write the memo?
So there were two issues. So what I was going to do was add a fourth recommendation, that the individual that's doing the training on a specific use of force, tasers, firearms, whatever, should not be the one that's writing the use of force opinion.
And why is that? I'm not sure I understand.
Well, it kind of creates a conflict of interest if the person training is basically justifying their actions of training, especially if they're training something that violates policy. That's kind of what my point was. So again, in this case, the use of force opinion is basically adding things that are not in the policy. In this case, it was pre-assaultive cues. Pre-assaultive cues are not described. It's not a reason to taser someone. And yet in their use of force opinion, they were basically saying because someone remained silent, that was, quote, pre-assaultive, and therefore it was a justified reason to use a taser. So his use of force opinion was going against the policy, is why this whole memo is coming up.
Yeah, I get that, but it seems to me that the people who train on the use of force should be the ones who are experts. I agree that their use of force opinion should be reviewed, but I'm not sure I have a problem with having the experts be the ones who write the memos.
I don't have a problem with the experts being the ones with the memos, but I do think that there, as Brendan was saying, is potential pretty significant fear of bias and or conflict of interest when the person who was in charge of the training of the officers who did the illegal use of force, in a particular case, at least we saw, was attempting to justify that use of force by going outside policy. And so inherently, like, the optics are really bad on that. I think, at the very least.
My question would be, who else is qualified to write that opinion?
And that's a fair question too, which is where you get into the outside thing.
Well, then,
Exactly.
and secondly, I think, part of our job is to see whether or not the officers are doing what they are trained to do. And if there's a problem with the trainer, then that ought to be addressed. But in terms of the actions of an officer, if an officer was trained to do a certain thing and the officer does as he or she was trained to do, can you have a sustained finding for them doing exactly as they were trained to do?
Yeah, that's a fair point. Well, how about this? Going back to what I was saying to try to keep it clean. Let's strike that issue because I think we need to do more research before we can make that recommendation of the person that does the training shouldn't be the one that writes the use of force opinion. So let's hold off on that while we do research. And then maybe what we do is we modify the review process. My personal opinion, and I want to hear what all of you think. I feel like it needs to be higher up than just a sergeant. So that's why I put in here a lieutenant or captain. And maybe what we even do is maybe it needs to be, it's kind of like, when we have to do things, we know with the commission that it goes through, and Charmaine as our executive director has to sign off on it, and it kind of goes up the chain. Maybe we have the lieutenant, the captain, and I have to look at the flow chart or the org chart for the department. I'm not sure which assistant chief officially would review training, but maybe we include whoever that one is. And my point on that first one is not only I want there to be a documentation trail. I want them to have to review it, approve it, and essentially sign off on it. So it's very clear, if I'm the officer that wrote it, I sign off. Here's what my opinion was. My supervisor signs off. Their supervisor signs off. And how far we want it to go, that's another story. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think we should add anything above the captain of training?
As long as it goes through legal, for me, that's absolutely essential. And I mean, in this case, we have him creating a new category of behavior, so-called pre-assaultive cues, and also extending that to the point where he said that's essentially assaultive, and that officers shouldn't wait for the assaultive to happen. They should pick up on the pre-assaultive and go on the offensive. And I don't think that was the intent of that 1.07. It's certainly not written with any sort of hedging or wiggle room or anything. And I just think that's a legal issue for me.
Well, and to, adding to Nancy's point, to me, it seems, and I wasn't on this case, so I don't know the specifics, but it seems to me a little bit as if an officer was not complying with the policy, and through the introduction of the pre-assaultive cues into the rationale, their behavior was essentially curbed to be within policy. So
Exactly.
Although it is not part of the policy, so, it does seem a little weird.
Well, don't miss any closed meetings, Andrea.
I will try not to.
This, and again, just as a reminder for everyone, this memo doesn't go out until after the full commission reviews it and approves it. So I guess what we could just do is we could leave the memo as it is for now. And then when we bring it to the full commission, we can solicit feedback from all of the commissioners and we can kind of explain our deliberation process, what we were considering, and then see if they want to chime in and make any changes. So unless there's any other conversation on this, I think I would say the motion on this one is to forward the draft memo to the full commission for review and approval.
Are you gonna make the change and I guess add the assistant chief? Or no?
I can. I can. I think what we were thinking of doing is we're just holding off and waiting until we present it to the full commission, and then we can let them know what we were thinking of making changes to. But I can make that one edit to that first bullet to include the assistant chief. So with that amendment, can I have can I get anyone to sponsor that? Since I wrote it,
I sponsor that. I move to do what you said, Brendan.
I'll second.
Robin and Nancy. I'm gonna say I don't want to make a motion on my own memo, so that's the only reason why I'm asking everybody else.
Okay,
Sherman, can you do a vote?
Sure. Commissioner Case,
Yes.
Commissioner Vaughn,
yes.
Commissioner Spruce,
Yes.
Commissioner Delbert Griffin,
Yes.
and the chair abstains. Motion passes 4-0 to 1.
Excellent. Oops. Let's see if I can fix this. This is a curse of having too many windows open. There we go. Stop share. All right. The next item we have is discrimination policy. So we being San Diego Police Department, we have a non-biased policing policy. It's not officially a quote discrimination policy. And so I know it's kind of come up within the community to possibly come up with a standalone actual discrimination policy that we can discuss. So Patrick, probably a year ago or so, did a lot of research. He reached out to a bunch of different cities, departments across the country, try to find out what the best practices are, what they're doing. He can't be here today, but I do have his email up that I can actually, I'm trying to figure out if I should share this or not. I can probably read some of it actually, because it's probably what's easier than sharing, but actually, never mind. I'll just share this. I don't see any confidential information in there. Okay, so this is Patrick's email. He was kind of sharing his information based on his research. He was basically saying that, in his opinion, he feels that the problem is, one, how the policy, the current policy, that's 9.31, how it's applied, how investigations proceed, and which policy gets cited during those investigations. Can everyone see this, by the way? Is it big enough?
Can you make it bigger?
I think so. Maybe. Did that make it bigger?
Yes.
Okay. So this chunk here is the current policy. That's 9.31. That's the non-discrimination, or sorry, non-biased policing policy. So that whenever there's a discrimination allegation, this is what is cited going to policy. Now, again, this is Patrick's email. So he was saying this portion of policy is only useful if the complaint alleges that a particular stop has taken specifically because of a protected category. Given the practice of pretext stops, it's virtually impossible to prove or sustain such allegations. For members of the public, a pretext stop is, say, for example, an officer is following someone and I forget to turn on my blinker when I make a turn. They pull me over because I failed to turn on my blinker. And maybe what they're really looking for is, I had something suspect in my car and they thought maybe I had a warrant. The reason why they pulled me over was the blinker, but they might be doing an investigatory stop to try to see if there's more information there. So what he was saying down here is if there's an allegation about a specific characteristic about which all officers have received training, the department's commitment to a non-biased policing includes providing all members with ongoing training related to the biases, including implicit, overt, bias or proxy, and all members are expected to understand their negative impacts on policing. There's an issue related to a stop, search, or seizure. Can I let you guys read that real quick? And then kind of the issue I think that he raised the most was this one here is most relevant in general is for all discrimination allegations, but it's typically never used by AA, is evaluating the behavior. So members shall not base any enforcement action in whole or in part on race, color, ethnicity, religion, national origin, age, disability, gender, lifestyle, sexual orientation, etc. So Patrick, and again, he did an amazing amount of work doing a bunch of research, looking nationwide. His comment was this creates a much broader and enforceable expectation that no portion of a given encounter in whole or in part can be based on protected characteristics. If a stop is valid, for example, but the officer behaves in a discriminatory way for even a moment of the encounter, that the officer has violated policy. So with that, I kind of want to open up the floor to see what comments are. I know obviously discrimination's a hot button topic nationwide. We wanted to see, does it make sense for us to try to come up with a more specific discrimination policy? Do we leave it as it is, where we just continue to use the non-biased policing? I think there's pros and cons to both, but I wanted to open it up for discussion. And Robin, I see your hand up.
Lost without this memo of his.
I put up my hand. Yes, I did. Let me lower it. And you basically cover this, but I think the clarification that has come up in cases that we have looked at in our particular team, at least, is that what IA typically has focused on is, from what we've seen, is that arrest piece. So am I discriminating in arrest? And that's a piece, obviously, and a major one. What we have become increasingly concerned about is the discrimination that is taking place once a person perhaps is being detained legally or lawfully, without question about that, right? So like, you didn't pull this person over because of a protected class, but once you have that person in your control, essentially, they have been treating people unfairly and in a discriminatory manner. And so I know that that is a concern, is how do we address that issue? And I don't know, quite frankly, if another policy is required in order to address that, or if we just encourage and work with IA to understand that there are sort of two parts here. There's the part of discrimination based on arrest, but equally concerning and frequently, maybe I'm exaggerating when I say frequently, but we've seen that it's been tough because the IA investigations say, no, there's no discrimination because the discrimination isn't apparent in the arrest, but we very clearly see what we would view as discrimination happening once that person, lawfully or not, has been held in custody or held, So that's the concern that's come up, at least from my reading of cases. And that's partly why that Patrick is sort of hitting on that piece. Like, we're not using this piece of the policy at all in investigation.
Yeah, and I think I forgot to mention that. What Patrick had shared with me was he doesn't necessarily feel like we need to come up with a standalone kind of anti-discrimination policy. He just feels that the existing policy needs to be enforced kind of more effectively.
Yes.
So I think I neglected to say that. So thanks, Robin, for bringing that up. Anybody else?
So, I mean, what I'm confused, what is our recommendation?
I almost think, I don't necessarily know if we have to make a formal recommendation to the police department. I think we would just work with internal affairs to try to really flesh out how they're investigating discrimination allegations more effectively. And then I think if that's not proving effective, then at that point, maybe we revisit and then we send an official memo with a specific recommendation. Unless anyone else feels like we need to do something different, I don't really know if creating more work when we're already trying to get that done, I don't know if that's going to be effective. I don't think that's going to be necessarily the best use of our time or internal affairs.
I think we could do it with some training of our own for our people. And that would be to take what Patrick has uncovered, including the sections that he cited in this particular memo, and turn it into a training, effectively a CPP training bulletin, so that all of our teams have that same information and can apply it to their cases going forward. And then share it with IA, of course. But I'm not sure we need a separate procedure or policy. I mean, I found what he wrote to be extremely helpful. One of those quotes I was using right before I joined this meeting. So as long as everybody on the commission has that information and can use it, I think that's what's important, Brandon, for me, at least.
So I think part of the difficulty is that unless you can demonstrate an intent to discriminate or treat somebody differently, IA's legal counsel will not allow them to have a sustained finding. And so even though it doesn't say it specifically in the policy, in practice, unless you're able to show intent, they won't sustain an officer for discrimination, even though it may clearly be discriminatory behavior and the case of a very clear implicit bias.
Seriously, Doug?
Yeah, I disagree, Doug. I think that that's the rereading of the policy that we're looking at that Patrick has pointed out so eloquently, is that in fact, when you read that policy, and
I know what the policy says, but I just know
Right.
what the department will not, and
Right.
the legal counsel will tell them that unless you can prove intent, the officer is going to prevail and appeal. And so unless they can show that the officer intended to treat them differently, the department will never issue a sustained finding for discrimination.
Sure, and I hear what you're saying, but I think that one thing that we need to look at, and I think that Patrick's point was in his writing, is that we're not even using part of the policy though. And so the part of the policy that we've been using is only the arrest one. And we've been basing some of that, we really are thinking on sort of the IA investigations, and that they focus just on the discrimination in arrest. And I think that there's quite a bit, the language is fairly broad in that other piece that we haven't been addressing. And I don't know that I have no idea, as you know, I'm new, and you certainly know way more about all of this than I do, Doug. But from when I read that, there is space to be interpretative, right? And because of course, part of the challenge with discrimination is it feels subjective. And I think that's what legal counsel you're hearing is pushing back on, is sort of this almost subjectivity part. But when you read that 9.31,
I agree with you.
Bodyworn Camera, I don't know. I feel like there would be some space for a pushback at least.
Well, I agree with you, and I think we can push back. I'm just saying that even though it's clear that in cases where the officer, in part, I don't have the language in front of me, but it refers to in part, if a person's characteristic, whether it be race or gender or sexual orientation, or whatever, had any part of their decision, then it would be considered to be discrimination. And it doesn't say in the policy that the officer intended to discriminate. It doesn't. The word intent is not in the policy. But in practice, what we've been told on cases that we've asked about is that that unless they can show that the officer intended to discriminate, they don't think that they can prevail in an appeal, and their legal counsel, all sustained findings are reviewed by their legal counsel, and their legal counsel, won't sign off on cases unless they can show a clear intent.
So what Robin's saying is ideally we would be able to bring that as a sustained finding, and what Doug is saying is in reality, forget it. And so we're going to have to, going forward, we will all have to be mindful of that. And it's possible we would bring disagreements when we see it very strongly, which I can see us doing. And in other cases, we may have to do and agree with a comment that we really think this is a wrong thing to do. I mean, we just have to keep pushing where we can. But I understand Doug would not say that if he didn't know it to be true. So we'll
I
You know,
fully believe
and
that's
maybe
what
we need to
happened.
add to the policy that regardless of the intent of the officer.
Oh, that sounds wonderful.
I like that. It's not intent, it's impact, right?
Should be behavior.
Yeah, you know, just that you're absolutely right, Robin. It's not about, you know, many people discriminate on a daily basis and they don't intend to. It's, you know, these categories are so inscribed into our social personas that we have a very hard time actually not discriminating, right, on a day-to-day. So I think that the intent cannot somehow be the leading, you know, the leading part that determines whether an officer discriminated or not. I think that should be at least considered.
Yeah, and I would push for that change and see what, you know, the discussion is. You know, I'm sure the pushback is going to be that it's difficult to discipline a person for an action that that was unintentional.
Sure, but we're also partly here to get uncomfortable, right? So like, I mean,
Yeah,
I think,
I'm just saying that I think that we ought to push for a change in the wording of the policy and see what you know, what discussion flows from that.
I like it, Ted.
I can see a problem with it though, because I think the discipline for discrimination is probably pretty stiff.
It is, and that's part of the reason why
Yeah.
they take the position that they do, and it's understandable.
Yes.
But I think
So-
we should engage the department in a dialogue and see if we can find a happy medium.
Sounds good to me.
All right, so I guess I have a couple different things here. Initially, I was going to say let's table this and keep it on there and we can discuss it further, but I think we actually have a motion for recommendation. I think Patrick had one, he wanted to remove the last sentence of the courtesy policy, replacing it instead with 9.31 and removing the reference to 9.20 from 9.31. So I'll send this out to everybody. I think most of you already have it, but there's a bunch of policies and procedures that kind of interlap and they kind of point to each other. So I think that was one of the corrections there. And I think to Doug's point is to make a recommendation to take out regardless of the intent of the officer.
No, to add regardless of intent.
Or sorry, add, sorry.
Yeah.
And then I think I heard someone mention the behavior of the officer, because I don't think the behavior's in there, because if their intent's not there, but their actions, their behaviors are doing something, that probably needs to be addressed. So
Yeah, and just to also add, you know, our purpose may not be to push for officers getting, you know, charged with or convicted with or whatever, just acts of discrimination. But I think what we as a commission ultimately want is more awareness. We want to create more. We want to get people to start thinking about how they may be engaging in acts while they are policing that could be understood as acts of discrimination, although there is no sort of, you know, viable way that will end up in them being convicted of having discriminated against somebody, but just to start a dialogue around how this behavior is happening. And, you know, somebody needs to kick off this conversation so it can be had.
And I think in these cases, sometimes that starts with policy, right? Like, okay, well, this is our policy and here's why. And I agree with you. We don't want it. I mean, because we're all on this panel have walking around implicit bias that we're acting on all the time, right? So our goal isn't punitive, right? But as you said, our goal is really to help educate and to change behaviors and, you know, write it down, you know, have a part of their training, you know? Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, I work in the behavioral health community, and I cannot, you know, even people who've gone to school, who have master's degrees in social work and in psychology, and people who have PhDs in those fields, they all still have bias and they still all act on it. We have to do so much training in this area because we work with people who are our clients, right? So if that community has to do all this training and all this, you know, has to go through all that awareness shaping, although they have degrees in these areas, then it kind of gives you an insight into how much effort really is needed.
okay, so for this one, I have a couple just action items for us. It's not necessarily a motion, but one of them was that we would do a training for ourselves, for CPP commissioners on discrimination based on Patrick's email. So we can probably have Patrick help kind of, lead one of those training sessions if he's willing to do so. I also have that we'll work with internal affairs to discuss exactly how they investigate and do discrimination cases, to see if we can look at some of Patrick's suggestions on focusing on certain components of the policy rather than kind of the super high level ones. And then also we can ask internal affairs to do kind of a presentation for like our continuing education when I'm at one of our open sessions on how they investigate discrimination allegations. I think that'd be helpful for all the commissioners to kind of understand exactly how that process works, what they do. So that's kind of our action items on our side. So I guess the motion, and I will probably need to do something. Well, I was going to say separately, I think there is the making some recommended changes. So I would probably want to work with Patrick and Doug, but it was adding that regardless of the intent of the officer to change the policy, talk about the behavior, and then also remove some sentences from the courtesy policy and making sure it aligns with the non-biased policing policy. So I think what probably makes the most sense is, because this is such a big issue, I don't want to, I think the best word to use, I don't want to do it, a half good job on it. I would almost rather bring this back. So I think what I'll do is I'll work with Patrick and all of you. We can try to draft some proposed language, and then we can bring it back to the policy committee. And then once we are satisfied with it on our side, we can then send it to the full commission for review and feedback. So unless anyone disagrees, I see a thumbs up. I'm going to table this and kind of carry it over to our next meeting.
Okay.
Unless there's any dissent. So I think we're good. Perfect. Sorry. Nope, I thought I heard someone. Oh, perfect. The last item we had, this is something Andrea brought up, was reviewing homeless encampment sweep processes. She had recommended reaching out to the sheriff's department to kind of see what they had done or do. I mentioned, I think before we started, I actually tried reaching out to their email address, and unfortunately it looks like that email address bounces anyone that's not under the sheriff's department website. So my emails all bounced back. So I will try to do a little bit of research. I think Andrea said she was going to try to introduce me to someone. I think the idea there is we've seen cases, and the department has already made some changes. So I know they used to go in the middle of the night to homeless, camps, and they would kind of sweep them out. Then they've changed that policy. They don't do that anymore. So there's a lot of things the police department has already done to change how they deal with the homeless community. But I think we need to do a little bit of research on our side to try to find out a little bit more of what other departments, other cities, what they do, and then we can see what the best practices are, and we can make a recommendation on that. So
if I can chime in, I don't want to get into the details of the case, but we had a recent case where, and this was fairly recent, it wasn't in the middle of the night, but it was before daybreak, and so it was still dark outside, and that contributed to a very dangerous situation. I won't go into the details. And in addition, the subject was not a primary English speaker, and it seemed to us that if they're going to be doing a sweep, that they ought to have somebody who speaks Spanish as part of the sweep. And so those were two things that we were recommending specifically from the case that we reviewed.
So I think, again, kind of like the discrimination one, I think this is a pretty important topic. So I think what we need to do is gather a little more research on our side before we try to make any recommendations to the full commission. So Andre, if you can introduce me to your contact there, I can start doing some initial legwork to try to get some details. I can bring that back to the policy committee, and then we can review that and then see what recommendations we might want to make.
Sure.
Does anyone else want to chime in on thoughts or process with the homeless sweep issues?
I think we should also inquire with the PD, not just with the sheriff's department, because they may have separate approaches to this, right? And I think, I understand that the necessity for homeless sweeps. I'm just not sure I understand why they are being conducted the way they are conducted, and sort of what the reasoning is behind it and what the rationale is. I could understand if police or deputies team up with a team of social workers, you know, so they kind of let them go in, make sure there's no threat there, and then, right, because all that happens is that people are either going to be taken into custody for what we call quality of life crimes, unless of course they have involvement with more serious issues like, you know, drugs and guns and that sort of thing. But a lot of people are taken, and I don't think the public realizes that a lot of people are taken into custody for quality of life crimes. They're misdemeanor crimes that happen by virtue of people being homeless, not because they are criminals, not because they're offenders, because people are homeless. And so, you know, I think that homeless sweeps are a good sort of point where we can start that conversation, is how to bring together law enforcement with community groups to make sure that those who need to go to custody for valid reasons go, and those who don't need to go, because it costs a lot of money to book somebody into jail, costs a lot of taxpayer dollars, let me tell you. So, you know, to open up an avenue for that person to hopefully be able to access services and interrupt their homelessness. So I think that's really the background of why I'm bringing this up.
Can we request that somebody from, what is it, the neighborhood policing division, whatever the division is that handles the homeless sweeps, come to one of our, maybe our policy committee meetings? We can ask, you know, questions about how their policies are. And after we better understand what their procedures are and the reasons for it, we can maybe make more informed recommendations.
I
I was
would
gonna say, I'll
a good subject for one of our open meetings, a presentation on this subject.
Yeah, that would be good too. Maybe do that first, and then after we do that, you know, there are questions or suggestions made, then we can refer it back to this committee. That might be a good idea.
And I had high hopes for some of it because they put out a training bulletin with respect to encroachment, which is the basis for making people move, I think, Andrea, anyway, where they have a process of contacting. They're supposed to keep track of how many times they contact people, and that they contact them and give them educational information and safety kinds of information the first couple times. And I had hoped that could be implemented across the board, so that it might mitigate, or at least somehow soften the approach.
Yeah, and I think if you don't have an understanding of what population you typically find in these encampments, if you don't understand that population, then you will not know how to approach them and how to get them effectively into services. You know, many of these individuals they are so disconnected from institutions, organizations, and services. They don't want to go into a shelter. Nobody wants to go into a shelter, let me tell you. Shelters are not nice places to be. Your stuff gets stolen, people attack you, people don't treat you nice, you know, so this is part of the reason why people go into these homeless encampments, because they don't want to be in a shelter. So, you know, it's very important to understand who you're actually dealing with in these kinds of homeless sweep situations, so that you can match the need of the community to the response that you're giving.
I think what might make the most sense, and I think Doug brought it up, is let's maybe Andrea and Nancy, maybe we can work on a continuing education topic. I mean, obviously it's a big topic. We don't want it to take the whole open session meeting, but I think it might be a good thing for that kind of a presentation to be given to the full commission. And then we can decide if that's something that we, to Doug's point, if we want to refer that back to the policy committee to take action on. The other thing I'll do is I can send out the, it's called the HOT team, homeless outreach team. I'll send out, they have, you know, their procedures. It's on the public website. It's not confidential information. I can send that out to the commission as well, because that has a lot of the details of what they do. And the police department, I know there's, you know, the quote defund issue is really big on let's take that away from the police department. But the reality is right now, the department is responsible for doing a lot of that. And they do try to do a good job of going out and offering services and trying to get people assistance so they can get them off the street. So I don't want it to sound like the police department's just going in and doing all these horrible things. They are going in and they are trying to help people. And they do try to get them the services that they're able to, whether it's like, mental health, addiction treatments, anything like that. They do try to get those services and match people up to the opportunities that are available to them. So there's a lot going on. It's a huge topic. It's unfortunately not something that's going to be going away anytime soon. But I think for us, the next best step is probably to have a presentation to the full commission, and then we can decide if we want to refer that back to policy. And then in the meantime, Nancy, Andrea, and we can do a little bit of research, see what other areas are doing, and then bring that back.
Okay.
And with that,
Can I just step in real quick and just kind of clarify something really quickly? So
Sure.
do you mind? So I think that the word, and I don't mean any disrespect to anybody, but I think the word sweep kind of gets overused a little bit when it comes to neighborhood policing division. We don't actually just send 10 or 12 cops and put them online and start kicking people off the sidewalk. That's not really the way that that works, and we've never done that. But there are times when we are going down there in force, I should say, I guess, to go down there and start finding the biggest population of homeless people that we can to provide them with the best service we possibly can at one time. So we'll go down there with our social workers. We'll go down there with our team of people who are armed with all kinds of information and resources. And we go down there primarily for that purpose, is to hopefully find those folks that want the shelter or that want to go to another location other than having to live on the street all day. So it's not all about the enforcement, but let me just kind of say something about that as well. I mean, I think that it's informative for you to know that down there, especially, and I'll talk about the East Village, which is where we have a very large population of homeless. There are people that are down there that are selling ghost guns. They are selling fentanyl. They are conducting human trafficking. We do have victims of very violent assaultive crime down there. So we have a responsibility also to respond to calls of service. And I think sometimes, the fact that our police officers are down there and they're interacting with people and in those homeless encampments, that the assumption is that we're down there harassing the homeless. And in fact, if they're homeless, truly if they need services or that are provided, but if they're down there and they're committing crimes and they're victimizing people who are trying to live peacefully on the streets, that's also our job, is to intervene and to take action on that. The other thing too, I think is important for you to know, is that when we do contact people, obviously we talk to them, we try to build a rapport, we do get their information. We do find out that some of them have been involved in crimes in the past. We do have some 290 registrants down there. Of course, those are the people that have been convicted of sexual crimes against people, in particular children. And they may have warrants out for their arrest. That is, we are obligated by the law. There's a judge that signs an order that says we're compelled to take this person into custody. You can imagine if somebody has a warrant for child molest and we ignore that warrant and we don't take that person into custody, we could actually be in contempt of that judge's order. And that's something that police officers are not going to do. So I just wanted to kind of clarify that. I would also encourage, if you have any questions about neighborhood policing and what we're doing, I think you would find it very enlightening if you rode around with them for a day and just saw exactly what it is that they do. I think you'll see that they are a very compassionate group of people who actually asked to go to those units because they have an interest in helping people who do need those services. So I would offer that up to anybody. Give me a call. I'd be more than happy to set that up for you as well. So I just want to just kind of clarify a few things, Brandon, and I appreciate you allowing me to do that. We're always here to answer any of those questions and certainly to facilitate any type of information that you might need or additional support.
Yeah, well, and commenting on a question, I mean, sometimes the sweeps are necessary. For example, there are canyon sweeps where there are homeless encampments that have caused fires, especially in the current environment, and that can't be tolerated. And so sometimes it's necessary to move people from where they are. We're just asking questions about what the process is. And then my other question is totally unrelated, but because you raised the question of when we're going to be able to do ride-alongs again.
Yep. If you absolutely. Yep.
So I was just, to interrupt real quick, I was just gonna to say that was something that we're gonna talk about when we have our meeting next week with the chief.
Okay,
And he'll be there as well, but that was one of the things for everyone else is here, obviously with COVID, ride-alongs were discontinued. We have new commissioners that obviously really want to be able to get that opportunity, because I think it's important for them as commissioners to be able to kind of see with that experience and to go on a ride-along. And we're getting a little off topic. I always recommend people try to do their home division first, but I would say do whatever area that you are most passionate about. So, I mean, if you wanted to do homeless outreach, because you're passionate about that, I think that would be the best one to do first. But there's a bunch of opportunities. Once we have that conversation with the department next week, I'll send an email, either myself or Charmaine will send out an email to all the commissioners, and we can try to get those ride-alongs going again if we get the green light to do that. But thanks for bringing that up, because I was actually gonna bring that up next week, but since you brought it up, might as well talk about it now. And with that, does anyone else have questions?
I was just going to let Chief McGrath know that where the sit along with the dispatch people is my favorite
Yeah.
thing to do, that my ride along with Hot was the second favorite and absolutely stunned me. Being with those people for several hours like that. Fantastic. It was just fantastic.
Thank you, Nancy. Appreciate it.
Sure.
All right, guys, if there's nothing else, I'll take a motion to adjourn. Everyone raises their hands.
second.
All right. And with that, we're adjourned at 6:15. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Everyone.